So, Artemis 2 update. So, they found the initial cause of the leakage. It was a blockage. And officially, they fixed it. Artemis 2 will be rolling back to the launch pad on this Thursday, March 19th. By April 1st of 2026, we'll have an official launch, sending 4 humans from Earth orbit to the moon orbit in just 10 days. So it's 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, and they're going to be setting their sights on what will become the future of space exploration and the continuation of the future space race against other competitors that are competing against us back to the moon and sending the first settlements on the lunar surface. So that gives you a question. Why all of a sudden are we going back to the moon? Let's talk about it. So let's go back to my previous video where we talked about the entire history of the entire space race from 1957 to the finishing point, which is the moon, where we sent 4 astronauts and they set their first boots on the moon. So basically, 1957 was when the initial space race began. And basically, highly recommend this book too. You can get it on Amazon for like 19 bucks. Yeah, and it goes over how the beginnings of the space race began. From 1957, we were outsmarted by the Soviet Union at the time, because the Soviet Union launched the intercontinental missile that was launched into low Earth orbit, basically. And this little sphere contained a radio transmitter inside of it, and it was sending bleep signals. The first ever satellite became Sputnik 1. Yeah, so it was encased in an intercontinental ballistic missile shell, basically, and it was sending bleep signals, bleep, 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 and that spooked the United States, basically. And we were asking, how on earth did the Soviet Union, even though they're communist, how is it possible that they beat us at something so technological? That's what we've been asking ever since that was launched. We were freaked out. The military was also freaked out because these radio transmitters, these little bleep signals, were being used to spy on us. And again, we were spying on other countries as well. We were doing this and all that time before the Cold War and throughout the First World War, the Second World War, even before the World Wars, we were spying on each other. But this took a step further when they were sending bleep signals during the beginning of the Cold War, to spy on the United States, and as tensions are growing post World War II because of the whole, disputes. So basically, the disputes between the U.S. and the Soviet Union officially started post World War II. Before that, the Allies already knew that the war was going to end because we already defeated Germany. In June of 1945, the Potsdam Conference between FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, basically, were good chums. They were discussing what happens during the post Second World War against Germany. We already knew that Germany was not already defeated, but actually we had Japan that wasn't defeated yet. The war was still going on. And then we want to understand what's going to happen to Japan right now as the war was already wrapping up and the Allies were winning. Well, the Soviet Union was going to go into Japan and declare war on Japan. And then the United States dropped the atomic bombs twice on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then eventually that's the end of the Second World War after September 1945. Now tensions grew between the United States and the Soviet Union because the United States basically said, we're going to rebuild the western part of Europe, and we're going to ally, with our allies. We're going to send them economic relief, by setting up the Marshall Plan, basically. The Soviet Union saw that the United States was up to something by rebuilding their economics. So basically, they kind of set up their own relief by giving the eastern part, of Europe, as communists. So it basically built the Iron Curtain that had descended across Europe. Because Churchill was in Missouri talking about what became the Iron Curtain. This is 1946, basically, when Churchill was there. Um, so yeah, so everything east of the Iron Curtain was all communist. Would belong to the Soviet Union, and then everything west was, what became NATO. And then the tensions kept growing as, the United States was giving economic value, pumping out billions of dollars to help Western Europe recover from the Second World War. And then the Warsaw Pact happened, and everything else was ramping up too. And then you had proxy wars with Korea in the 1950s, and then you had Vietnam, and that lasted 20 years. So basically, if you look at the entire history of during the Cold War of what really happened, it's no definitive answer in who started the Cold War. Some may say that the United States started it because of the nukes and everything that happened, or the Soviet Union started it because they rose to power. It's just there's no clear definitive answer because, like I said, both sides wanted something. After the post World War II, basically when Germany was defeated and they wanted a certain section of Germany, they split it into different pieces. So the Allies kept their western half, and the Soviet Union wanted their eastern half. Czechoslovakia was also split up as well, the same way. Basically, in Germany, it was split up in different sections. The Allies controlled that side, the Soviets controlled that side, and Berlin was also split in half as well by the West being the Allies, and then the Soviet Union controlled the eastern side of Berlin. But even though Berlin was on the eastern half of Germany, same thing you can go with Czechoslovakia as well. They wanted the territory in half to split off. So basically, there's no clear definitive answer who started the Cold War. So yeah, you can ask one way, they say one way, or if you ask the other side who started that, they said it's going to be we are the ones that started it, or it's vice versa. We were freaked out, and over time, when we got to the 1960s, things starting to ramp up. Political tensions were split. Now, we were in battle with the Soviet Union against all the odds, and then during the 1960s, the space race had begun, and we were just getting outsmarted by the Soviet Union. Sputnik 2 was launched. The first mammal was Laika, the first dog. Laika was found in the streets of Moscow. And basically, they used that as a science experiment to launch the second generation Sputnik into orbit. And then upon reentry, she overheated. She burnt up in the Earth's atmosphere. Yeah, so that didn't go well. And then Yuri Gagarin, the first ever human, successfully completed one full orbit. And then by 6 weeks later, we sent the first American up into space, but he didn't complete a full orbit. That embarrassed the United States automatically because we were outsmarted by the Soviet Union now. And then over time, as NASA opened its doors in 1950 under Eisenhower, and then we gave NASA more budgeting, gave them more technology, and then they built something, and then, as years go by, 1960s kept going, the Soviet Union sent the first human to do a spacewalk, and then we followed after 1 month later. Again, that totally embarrassed the United States because now we are way behind now. Soviet Union is now ahead of us. They kept outbeating us over and over and over until basically the finishing point was we're going to send the first humans to the moon. We choose to go to the moon under Kennedy's administration. And then over time, Kennedy got assassinated in 1963. And then we had Johnson, and then we had Nixon. So during Nixon's time, because he got inaugurated in January 1969, that set the groundwork this NASA's budget was like at its absolute peak. So we gave them enough funding for NASA. And then eventually in July of 1969, the first four Americans set their sights on and landed on the moon. The Eagle has landed. And then Neil Armstrong got out of the Eagle, set his first footsteps, and eventually yelled out, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And that was the initial end of the space race. We made our territory, we marked our territory, and now the space race has ended because we declared the finishing line to be the moon, and we did. But everything else was going on, the Apollo missions, the Genesis, everything else, And then 1970s come around, and then tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were starting to improve, and we became chums again, and then setting the first shuttles, and we built the first space station together, the Space Station Freedom, which later became the International Space Station. And then, the tail end of the Cold War was Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall under Reagan's administration, and then the Berlin Wall fell, and then tensions with the Soviet Union was falling apart. By 1991, Christmas of 1991, the Soviet Union completely fell apart, and eventually, other countries were joining us and completing. We were best friends with Russia now after post Cold War. Now that led to other countries building their parts, which became the International Space Station in 1998. But there was one foe, China. See, China's economic value was lower, and then we said, China, not you. We do not want you to be part of this special project by building the International Space Station, because you have human rights violations and you have other things that we will hold against you, that are not allowing you to join us in this really cool project that we're doing. So when you told China no, basically China's economy increased, basically, and they set up their first space station by launching the first taikonauts, which taikonauts is another word for astronauts, and then kept going, and things kind of escalated. Again, let's say we found ourselves into another generation of the space race, and again, now the space race of the future has begun. Currently, with the Artemis program, Artemis 1, successfully without humans, did the first launch, and then the first orbit, and then the first orbit around the moon took 10 days. Artemis 2, which is, except now it's out of that delay now, which by this Thursday, Artemis 2, that vehicle, it will be back on its launch point, sending the first humans on that same trajectory route around the Earth and the moon. Artemis 3 will probably do the same thing. Artemis 4, we're going to officially launch on the south pole of the moon. So, that gets us to wonder, why all of a sudden? Why are we going back to the moon? We could have been on the moon in the 1980s, we didn't. 1990s, we didn't. 2000, 2010, well, in the 2020s, by the late 2020s, we are officially going back to the moon. So yeah, I guess you're wondering, why? So the other reason why that we went to the moon in the first place, after summing all of that up, the entire history of the space race just briefly, we felt geopolitically threatened by the Soviet Union. And then as tensions kind of starting to dissolve now and we became chums with the Soviet Union, we started to basically, build something with them. We started to collab. And then tensions kept, basically improving, and we became better chums now. The Soviet Union fell, we put together the International Space Station with other countries. And then eventually, we started to bring other countries except for China. So now, with this going on, with the next generation of the space race, the future, we are politically threatened now by China and other economies, because China, India, and then Japan are densely populated countries. China is second in population. India is the first by population. Both have 1.5 billion people. So yeah, we're battling against really strong economic powers against this because we want to become outsmarting each other by one day setting up the first ever permanent settlements on the moon, the first space stations on the moon. We have AI powered technology. We want factories on the moon. We want understanding how humans can survive, an atmosphere. I mean, there's no atmosphere on the moon. We want to understand how much water we can use as resources, as rations. We want, basically, we want to outsmart the other powers, but again, the other powers want to outsmart us and say, hey, we have better technology, and then we want to understand how we can get to the moon faster, and then that whole thing, that whole ideal is similar to what happened in the first space race, basically. Because we want to outsmart the Soviets, but the Soviets kept outsmarting us throughout the primarily of the 60s, basically. As everything in the world in the 1960s was really violent. And then, over time, see, we want to outsmart one another, and then this and that. We were politically threatened by that. So basically, that's why we decided to go back to the moon, because of China, India, Japan, other private companies and private countries that want to just come together and kind of just battle and duke it out until we eventually set our sights on the moon again and build whatever we want on the moon, basically. So yeah, that's pretty much why, we haven't been to the moon in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000, 2010, because we just didn't feel a threat. Other countries weren't posing a threat yet until we got into the 2020s. Everything was heightening up, and then everything else was going on in the world at the time, and then now we brought Artemis coming up, and then setting our sights on Mars. We will have another generation of the space race, competing against each other to go back to Mars. So who knows? Who knows? I mean, the space race has never really ended. I mean, technically we are kind of in a space race still, but it's just in a very new generation now where we're talking about technology and settlement, basically, because I went against other competitors that are coming up against us. So basically, that's how and why we're going back to the moon. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. And as always, keep exploring.